You're listening to the Music Educator podcast with your host, Bill Stevens, the 21st century music educator man.
Podcasting from beautiful Leesburg, Virginia. Welcome to the Music Educator podcast, bringing you the latest tips, tricks, and practical advice you can use tomorrow. Here's your host and fellow music educator, Bill Stevens.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Music Educator podcast. My name is Bill Stevens. It is beautiful here in Leesburg, Virginia, where I'm podcasting from, and I hope it's the same where you're at. Today, in Season 4, Episode 8, we're going to talk about 7 variations on the traditional rehearsal method. Let's do this. Have you ever worked your tail off during a rehearsal and still feel like so much more could have been accomplished? Perhaps it was right after lunch, and the student engagement was just subpar, even with your most in-tune students. Today, we're going to discuss 7 variations on the traditional rehearsal method. The insights are provided by Miss Shelley Jago from her book, Teaching Instrumental Music, Developing the Complete Band Program. Despite the title of the book, several of these recommended rehearsal methods can and should be used in all music ensembles. Pod rehearsal. We will start with the pod rehearsal. In this teaching environment, we need to first set up the chairs so that they're in mini circles. These circles should be in groups of 4 to 8 chairs. Ms. Jago reminds us to be sure to set out enough pods so that every member of your ensemble has a chair. And it is up to the discretion of you, the music educator, to assign sections to a pod or mix parts. It is important to reserve these types of rehearsals when musicians understand a piece of music that they're working on adequately. In other words, student musicians need to know the tempos, rhythms, and cues without needing to rely on a conductor. One key benefit for the music director is that he or she can roam around the room with ease. More micro-oriented practices can be observed, and these practices include observing whether students are using proper posture, embouchure placement, and various other physical and audible strategies. Sometimes, it's difficult to properly analyze a student's audible skills if they're always playing in large groups. And in the pod rehearsal, the educator could listen and comment on tone, pitch, and the style the student musician is playing in. A pod rehearsal makes sense to use if you want students to work on more difficult or section-specific passages of music as well. As a result, this makes specialized part rehearsal time more meaningful. One of the advantages pod rehearsals have, in contrast to traditional seating rehearsals, is that students have a heightened sense of what is happening in the music when seated next to unrelated instrumentalists or voices. Scramble rehearsal. The second rehearsal variation is the scramble rehearsal. In this type of rehearsal setting, the room needs to stay in the traditional setup. However, what makes this arrangement different is that the music director needs to allow his or her student musicians to move to wherever they would like within the set. Ms. Jago points out that you may find band scenarios in which flute players often will rush to the back rows, whereas a lot of the low brass members rush to the front. Like the traditional rehearsal, the music director will continue to conduct from the podium. Musicians will need to continue to listen to improve balance and style, and it might come as a surprise to some players that they may hear new parts which were not heard before. Ms. Jago continues to urge directors to push their students to listen beyond their sections. By doing this, student musicians will better be able to recognize parts within the literature rather than unresponsively playing at each other. Silent rehearsal. The third rehearsal style is the silent rehearsal. This rehearsal style requires considerably more preparation than the previous two. This is because in the silent rehearsal, all previous verbal conducting cues are now done with various hand signs. I have personally tried this rehearsal method, and once you've defined the hand signs and what they mean, the session will run significantly smoother. Ideally, this communication needs to happen prior to using the silent rehearsal because you want to move quickly between locations in the music without even saying a word. For example, Ms. Jago recommends using an open hand with fingers together and the palm facing the music ensemble to signify stop. Additional forms of visual communication may include using fingers to communicate measure numbers. You could also signify to players to listen across the section by pointing to them and then lightly tugging on your ear. Ultimately, you want to develop a non-verbal communication system that works for you and your music ensemble. By practicing the silent rehearsal, you, as a conductor, will also improve on how you communicate with your facial gestures and baton technique. Think about where maybe 5 minutes of a silent rehearsal could fit into your traditional rehearsal. Often, when we speak less, students' oral and visual acumen intensifies. Remind students of this heightened perception and challenge them to use this in every type of rehearsal going forward. Analogy rehearsal. Next is the analogy rehearsal. This style of rehearsal requires you and your students to think a little outside of the box. This is because it requires all parties involved to use analogies and what we're going to call color words to provide rehearsal instruction. For example, instead of having violins and cellos play heavier and louder, you could ask them to play more regal and majestic. There are thousands of analogies you could use to get your point across to your players. Ultimately, be creative. Even try to create a database full of useful examples that tend to provide the best results for you and your group. Cueless conductor rehearsal. Unlike what the rehearsal strategy sounds like, clueless conductor rehearsal, the cueless conductor rehearsal strategy is defined as when the director takes a physical break from providing directions from the podium. As a result, the educator can walk around the room and observe. The music ensemble continues to play and takes cues from the other members within the group. The benefit of this rehearsal methodology is that the director can monitor students' physical and musical progress on a more individual level. However, this technique is most effective when the music being played is not too difficult. Since the musicians are relying on the conductor's cues, they are often more perceptive from an oral standpoint. Ms. Jago finds that using this technique is great for correcting tempos that tend to rush or drag. The reason for this is that since student musicians are not relying on a visual cue for tempo, the internal ensemble pulse tends to strengthen. Blitzkrieg rehearsal. According to Ms. Jago, Blitzkrieg refers to a lightning attack or bombardment. What does that mean? This means that every 15 to 20 minutes of a normal traditional rehearsal, throw in 2 to 4 minutes of intense rehearsal. Think of this much like if you were jogging at a regular pace and then boom, 2 minutes of fast sprints. When first practicing the strategy with your students, you will quickly notice who is on board with this sudden shift in intensity. As the ensemble becomes more accustomed to this methodology, expect more in your overall return in the ensemble's efforts, much like a 2-minute drill at the end of a football game. Singing and clapping rehearsal. The singing and clapping rehearsal method is another approach to perfection within the traditional rehearsal framework. This is different from other strategies because student musicians are asked to sing or clap in certain areas within the music instead of playing on their instruments. This method at first will be uncomfortable for some students, however, with regular practice, will be at ease. As a result of this practice rehearsal technique, music directors will be able to improve rhythmic passages, stylistic interpretations, dynamics, tone, and pitch production. I personally feel that the singing component of this rehearsal strategy has far more reach into musician development than many directors realize. Why not try this out and give it a chance? Conclusion. In conclusion, Ms. Jago has outlined 7 practical approaches to alternative rehearsal methodologies. Each possesses clear benefits and can certainly make your rehearsals more effective and save you time. These techniques can be used in virtually any large ensemble and should bring much needed variety to the rehearsal room. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have for today, but I want to thank you again for joining me for another episode of the Music Educator podcast. I truly find pleasure in collaborating with you, lovers of music and educators. If you found value in today's episode, please feel free to comment and rate us on the Music Educator podcast app, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other podcast aggregators. It really helps us become discoverable. Also, check us out at our blog at bandbuzz.org, our podcast website, themusiceducatorpodcast.com, or our TPT or Boom Card stores. That's all I have for today. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Music Educator podcast. For the latest tips, tricks, and practical advice you can use tomorrow. You can subscribe to our podcast on every podcast aggregator or download the Music Educator app for free in the Apple or Google Play app stores. Furthermore, visit our blog at www.bandbuzz.org for additional music education resources. We will see you on the next episode of the Music Educator podcast. And remember, music can change the world.